Hi everyone, welcome. I'm preparing to check in on these two trays here. You can see that they're labeled as ANC, which is my abbreviation for African night crawlers. These two systems, I mean, if you look around, they certainly resemble everything surrounding them, but they're a little bit different. While all my other systems are in the process of composting, it was 10 days ago that we sort of transitioned these to what I consider to be sort of a downstream later phase of the system's life cycle, and they're now migrating. So basically that just means I'm trying to get the worms to exit their finished castings so those castings can be harvested and so that those worms could be moved on to greener pastures. And it's just my my approach to doing it. So why don't we get those two systems out here onto the bench, and then we can see how they're coming along, give them a little bit more food, and see if we can help that migration smooth ahead into the future. So let's get to work. Oh yeah, and for anybody who was curious about what this meant down here in terms of their new environment being prepared for 60 plus days now, that's what's going on in this black tub over here. So basically, more than 2 months ago already, I think it was a kind of a false start. We did try to I think initiate some sort of a later stage process in the life cycle of the bin in these systems, and then we called that off, went back to everyday composting. But at that same time, 2 months ago, we did already anticipate the need to, give these guys a new space to live in. Some people might be questioning, why hang on to a batch of material reserved for one particular population for 2 months? If it's not being used here, why not use it elsewhere? I guess because the material was sort of inoculated with castings from these worms, so in a way I already kind of imagined that, that system being sort of cultured to be very similar to these environments right here. Man, oh man, there are a lot of springtails over here. Curious, same story over here. Our feeding zone indicators. Helping us get back to the feeding zone. In a system like this, it's quite obvious, but man, look at all that springtail activity, especially over there. Okay, yeah, I'm sorry. One more time before we put this thing away for good, there was also an unusual reference down here in terms of feedings. So technically this is in my counter on my spreadsheet. This feeding, horizontally fed, registers as just another feeding as far as I'm concerned, but technically the base number for prior to this last feeding, which was geared specifically for getting the worms out of there, and any stuff produced by that feeding would just, as far as I'm concerned, end up going with the worms. So 26 feedings worth is what generated all the castings we're trying to harvest. Any feedings after 26 in my mind are sort of an add-on, really facilitating the migration, not so much something that gets chalked up to your everyday composting. So that's just my weird way of trying to capture that or distinguish it separately. This part of the migration process always definitely interests me. I'm always very curious to see how early stage progress is coming along. So it'd be kind of cool to see lots and lots of worms down here. But I always want to set my expectations realistically to say, hey, it might take time for them to warm up to the new space. Give it some patience. Don't get anxious. So I'm seeing some worms definitely hanging out. The material, I would say, is not terribly moist, but I've not really dug in deep yet. Let's just do a quick little surface probe on bin number 1 over here too. For whatever reason, I guess from my point of view, left to right is bin number 2 and then bin number 1, but it really doesn't matter especially when you strive to keep these systems as sort of twin arrangements as I have here, which really means right down to the estimated worm count in both systems. It was thought to be almost identical, so that's the reason certain systems like these do earn the extra designation, not just like a buddy bin, but basically a twin bin. I think I even went into an over-the-top detailed explanation as to how I come up with these weird names. So now I just couldn't resist now at this point. I felt squirming down low, and I just wanted to dig down deep. And yeah, we got lots and lots of worms coming together here. Let's see if that's the same deal over here. Yeah, look at that. Man, we got some nice migration activity happen here. All right. Good to see, good to see. So what I've got for them is just kind of more of the same. Last time they probably got coffee, because I could see coffee filters here that were used as feeding zone indicators. More coffee. This is just potato peel. And I guess the other thing that's a little bit of an oddball substance is some bread, old dry bread. There's even some mold growing there, pizza crust even. Stuff that's just been sitting around for many days, getting very dry, so I soaked it. Kind of sprayed it down, and it's been soaking. So why don't we just give them their food? We can get things covered up here, and then maybe we can just take a quick probe through all of the castings, just to see how our material's shaping up as far as, from the perspective of depopulation or worms exiting the stuff. I mean, it's hard to tell just from seeing the worms that have collected here what to expect in terms of, how many of all the worms in the system does this account for. But gradually we'll start seeing fewer and fewer worms hanging out over in the finished castings, coming over to this side of the bin, because this is where all the fun is. This is where everyone's hanging out. It's the place to be. So I've got this tendency to want to kind of push this more work stuff inboard and set up the new, fresh stuff, or, we're not going to be putting too much stuff in here, but anything that's kind of going in new, just putting it on this far end, giving it a chance to also become cozy for the worms to want to come over and hang out in. And it usually actually does become pretty active pretty quickly. So I'm still just trying to decide, when should I arrange the first haul out of worms? I'm almost thinking soon, from what I see here already. But I also want to see what's going on out here. So let's get this feeding taken care of. I've got some old napkins, paper towels here that I thought we could use as some of our foundational bedding in here. I've got my prepared bedding, and it is really heavy. On this go around, I must have used lots and lots of moisture to mix this stuff up. So it's been sitting here priming for a day or two, and it's nice and damp. It is soaked in a lot of moisture. And this is really just shredded paper and cardboard combined with small particle size leafy matter. So I think that right there should work well. I mean, we didn't push things aside too much. We didn't really give ourselves a whole lot more room here. And does it make sense to keep these so-called, I don't even know, did I ever give these things a name? They're just little partition walls meant to show where the feeding zone had been established. And just for visual aids, I guess, keeping them around. I'm sure some sign of them will still remain at the next check-in, so why don't we just keep them for now? And even though they're not really doing anything in terms of, keeping any of this particle matter that's over in the feeding zone out of our nice, clean, finished castings, it still serves as a pretty good visual aid, if you ask me. So let's drop in this coffee here too. We'll give them that bread. Bread, I have found, if you don't soak it like that, it's just going to sit in the system and sort of develop mold. So definitely makes good sense to make sure any bread that you give your worms is nice and damp. This piece here was rock hard, and there was no way I could have split it if it had not been first soaked a little bit. So besides some of this, I don't know, some of it is still a little bit dry, but I think it's going to pick up a little bit of moisture just by being out here in the feeding zone. Everything's all covered with plastic to keep the moisture content of the feeding zone down in here versus letting it evaporate away. And you know what? I made some breaded chicken, and the flour that was remaining from that, I figured I would just give that to the worms too. Almost like a impromptu worm chow. So rather than getting worm chow combined in with their feeding today, they just get some flour. Hopefully they like it. So that looks pretty cool. I think a little bit of extra bedding, a little more food, and you know, as long as we're giving them extra bedding, why don't we just give this whole space over here a nice topping too. I mean, the flour and the coffee on top doesn't strike me as like sweet, aromatic, juicy stuff that might, you know, attract pests, but you never know. I prefer just to play it more safe and not try to lure any sort of pests into any of my systems. Although we're in the middle of winter here and things are pretty cold, I haven't really seen any insects, at least not in a couple weeks. I think in my Vermibag Mini I saw one or two tiny flying insects a couple check-ins ago, but nothing since then. So knock on wood, hopefully things remain that way from an insect perspective. So let's get these feeding zones covered up and we're done with the feeding. But before we go, why don't we just take a quick inspection here, see how the material is doing. I see springtails. I feel good moisture within the system, but it is all very loose and crumbly, so that's also a pretty nice thing. There is still a good bit of one of these little thorns in my side, which is all these leaf stems sitting around. But you know, I'm not going to worry too much about it. It's just that they're kind of weird. As you plow through the material, they sort of stick out of the chunk of material that's in your hand, and then they kind of run back and forth almost like rakes, pushing stuff around that you didn't really intend to have pushed around. So I don't know, what do you think? Do we have a lot of worms remaining in here? To me it just doesn't seem that way, not much at all. But that was actually the side that's closer to the feeding zone. I'm always most curious about this furthest section, because it's going to be pretty much an early indicator as to how your process is working. You know, is it so much more cozy and comfortable on the feeding zone indicator side in the horizontal migration feeding zone area, that it's luring worms but also convincing them to stay? Because out here I don't even know if I saw a single worm, but then again I was so busy running my mouth I wasn't even paying attention to what I should have been. So why don't we use that as an excuse to try to do better over here in bin number 1. I think things look really good as far as migration goes. I'd love to hear people's thoughts. Do you agree? I mean, does it look like we're making good progress? To me, for only 10 days, it does seem pretty good. Here again, we're starting closest to the feeding zone, and it does look to me like there's a good bit of worms hanging out here. But sometimes when you start working your way further and further away from the feeding zone, you begin to see fewer worms. One thing I had thought about doing was to, you know, perhaps not cover up so thoroughly. When we first got in here, you might have noticed how the bubble wrap was pretty much covering the entire top surface, but we always got the option to kind of fold some of that back and leave some of this material out here furthest from the feeding zone, exposed to the air, give it a chance to dry even further. I'm sure all this tilling up that we're doing right now probably aids in the drying as well. Here in bin number 1, if you ask me, there's definitely more worms occupying this material out here. So perhaps giving this stuff a chance to air dry a little bit might help convince these wormies to go look for something a little bit more cozy from a moisture perspective. So I don't know, I didn't really go too crazy tilling this stuff up. Sometimes I really get very curious and I can't seem to stop plowing through the stuff trying to see how things look. So why don't we leave it at that? We're going to bring on the plastic, and I think just because I'm in no real particular hurry, but at some point we might switch over to leaving this stuff uncovered. But you know what, maybe here, just for the sake of compensating for what we observed to possibly be more worms hanging out over on the far end in bin number 1, maybe we will just cover up a little bit less thoroughly, and then maybe that'll get these two systems a little bit more in sync in terms of the progress of the migration. But I think the progress looks good, very good to me. So we'll come back in here, I don't know, at some point, maybe another 10 days or so, see how things are coming along. By that time, maybe we'll be ready to migrate worms. I don't know. We'll play it by ear and we'll decide when we get to that point. All right, everyone. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, As always, please don't forget to leave me a quick thumbs up before you go. That's always really appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel. That's very much appreciated as well. All right, everyone, have a great day. Thanks for watching. Bye now.